Hello, my name is Peter Whitehead, and this is one of the series of talks that I prepared for the Art Appreciation Group of the Bromley University of the Third Age during lockdown and made available when we couldn't have meetings in person. So the art group is a group of people who are interested and enthusiastic about art, but we don't pretend to be experts. The subject of this talk is the Pre-Raphaelites, probably the first avant-garde group in the history of British art. They were bent on introducing bold new ideas, encouraging change in art and challenging the broader culture. They rebelled against academic art and produced novel explorations of subjects from literature, poetry and the Bible. And they paved the way for later art movements, including the symbolists, the aesthetic movement and the arts and crafts movement. But it would be wrong to think that the Pre-Raphaelites weren't interested in commercial or popular success. They were. So this is the structure of the talk really. I'm going to first of all say who the Pre-Raphaelites were. They didn't actually have a printed manifesto as such, but they did put on record a lot of their ideas about what they were trying to achieve. And I'll try and explain how that differed from what was expected up to that point, particularly in the field of academic art, so art as recognised by the various national academies, and in this country by the Royal Academy in particular. We'll have a look at some of the topics that the Pre-Raphaelites covered. There are religious works, not necessarily direct illustrations of scenes from the Bible, works inspired by literature, and we'll see some of the type of literature that they concentrated on. But they were also concerned with contemporary life and social concerns, in particular the role of women in society. And we're talking about the early Victorian age, the disparity of treatment of men and women in society. And then we'll move on to look at what I've termed phase two Pre-Raphaelites. When the movement changed slightly, various members dropped out or pursued a different course, and others continued in a way which possibly is not consistent with the original Pre-Raphaelite ideas, but we'll investigate that a bit. So let's look at who the Pre-Raphaelites are. There were 7 members of the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. Other painters and individuals were associated with the group, and we'll look at them later on. But the first 3 are probably the most well known: William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. As he termed himself, he was actually christened Gabriel Charles, I think it is Dante Rossetti, but he put Dante first. John Everett Millais, and then James Collinson was a painter engaged to Christina Rossetti for a time, but he left the group at a very early stage because he was a Catholic and he felt that the accusations of blasphemy that were being hurled against the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood were incompatible with his Catholicism. Woolner is a sculptor, and the last 2, Stevens and William Rossetti, although they're associated with art, they're not artists in their own right. Both became journalists and critics. William Rossetti in particular was a very influential critic, while at the same time being a civil servant in the Inland Revenue during the day. all from affluent middle class backgrounds, all in their very early 20s. None of them are over 23 when the group is formed. And Millet in particular had been the youngest student admitted to study at the Royal Academy. He started studying there at the age of 11 and was very celebrated as a kind of child prodigy. So the groups formed in September 1848. 1848, the year of revolutions in Europe, and the formation of the Brotherhood can be seen in that way. Hunt and Millet attended the mass meeting of the Chartists in Kennington in 1848, so they were very associated with the need for change. But they actually only existed as a brotherhood for a short period. By 1853, they'd really ceased to function as a group. They'd ceased to be. They used to meet. They used to discuss art. They used to discuss each other's work, as we'll see. But in 1853, Millet was elected as an associate of the Royal Academy. So he's reabsorbed into mainstream art. And Rossetti, Dante Rossetti, said at that stage, "So now the whole round table is dissolved." There were other artists and people associated with the Brotherhood who were never actually members of the Brotherhood itself. Ford Madox Brown, slightly older artist, had studied in Antwerp and Paris, but was very influenced and very influential in the movement. William Dyce, a generation earlier, was actually very helpful to the Brotherhood. He was a member of the hanging committee at the Royal Academy, and as well as being influenced by their ideas, he also worked hard to ensure that their works were given a public viewing. Morris and Burne-Jones are later members of the movement, what I've called the Phase 2 Pre-Raphaelites, who are very much associated and disciples of Dante Rossetti. We'll come on to Ruskin later, a great art critic and very influential man. We'll see the influence that he had on the Pre-Raphaelites. But also need to recognise the important role of women in the group, either as models, mistresses or wives, and I've listed 3 of them there who we'll talk about later on. Effie Gray, the last one, originally at the time of the formation of the group was married to Ruskin. That marriage was annulled because of non-consummation, and Mrs. Ruskin moved on to be Mrs. Millet, later Lady Millet. So what were the Pre-Raphaelites trying to achieve? They thought British art was tired, repetitive, pompous and sentimental. It lacked honesty, and it was bound by rigid artificial conventions. Holman Hunt said that British art had substituted prettiness for beauty. The art world venerated the dark brown old master paintings without actually recognising that the colour was very often a result of the deterioration in the varnish, and the dark colour in the old masters was actually not as originally intended. It was just caused by the aging of the varnish. So the Pre-Raphaelites were looking for accuracy from nature, absolute truth, working into the most minute detail from nature and from nature only. So nature was their guide. So in doing so, what they did is reject the principles of the High Renaissance, the works of Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and their followers, the dramatic shade of light and dark, strict forms of composition, this kind of theatrical gesture, and this kind of standard landscape that you saw in these paintings. And the teaching at the Royal Academy was very much based on emulation of High Renaissance principles, emulation of these and the classical world. And Sir Joshua Reynolds, who set up or been the first president of the Royal Academy, was very much of the opinion that it was the classical and the Renaissance that needed to be emulated. The brotherhood, not all of whom actually studied or completed the study at the Royal Academy, called Reynolds Sir Slosher. The paint was just sloshed on without any thought. And as I said before, the group was a liberal group in many ways. That G.H. Lewis, who's quoted there, is the husband of George Eliot. Either give us true peasants or leave them untouched. In other words, this is all part of the naturalistic accuracy. Paint people as they are. Do not idealise them. And that's why they kind of reject the Renaissance, and why they're called Pre-Raphaelite, because the theory was that Raphael is the first painter who paints beauty rather than truth, and they wanted to go back to painting truth rather than the beautiful idealized figures and landscapes of Raphael. I mentioned Ruskin before, and he crops up in other talks. He's a very influential man of the Victorian period, but for our purposes here, what is important that he'd written a series of books called Modern Painters in 1843 to 1846, which had, as the quote suggests there, emphasised the need to paint nature in all its forms, but accurately, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, scorning nothing. So nature as it really is. And Ruskin had also said the hierarchies of Western art, which put the history painting at the top, landscape a bit further down, and still life still further down from that, was irrelevant. He was a great believer that the beauties of nature reveal God. And he referred in other works to a childlike submission to nature. He thought the classical forms were sterile, everything was very alike, and what he valued was the Gothic. So the work of early medieval, for example, stonemasons in cathedrals, were the type of thing that he really valued because it had this individual aspect. And had therefore more character. So if you think of the buildings of the Houses of Parliament, they are, being built at this time are the expression of everything Gothic, and that was something that Ruskin really supported. Ruskin also was appalled by the impact of industrialization on society, like another influential man of the time, Thomas Carlyle. And Ruskin, Carlyle and William Morris, who we've mentioned just previously, were really the inspiration for socialist thought in the early 20th century. These were the intellectuals or the thinkers that the early socialists really respected, because they focused on the impact of the industrial society and the role of the individual. But in this talk, it's really this go to nature in all singleness of heart, which was something that inspired the Pre-Raphaelites and Holman Hunt in particular when they were developing their own thoughts. So the techniques that they used were slightly different to what would have been taught at the Royal Academy. First of all, they used bright colours, and they were inspired by the frescoes that you might see in Italy for this, and they achieved this by having an under layer, a ground of thin of white paint, which while it was still wet they would paint with thinned oil on top. Now this gives a very luminous effect, but it is incredibly laborious. It takes a long time to do a painting by this method, and you can only work really on a very small area at a time. They were very much interested in putting in lots of detail, whether that was naturalistic or whether it was detail that helped convey the story, and they also used a lot of symbols. And the models were not necessarily conventionally pretty or fashionable. This changes later, the later Rossetti, and what perhaps we think as typical Pre-Raphaelite paintings of women. This is where I suggest they're not quite in line with the Pre-Raphaelite ideas. They're not painted from nature. They do become idealized. They occupy a world of the imagination, and there's quite an erotic feel to them, none of which I think would have been apparent in the Phase 1 Pre-Raphaelites. So the Pre-Raphaelites go for sharp form, for willowy Gothic figures, a lack of deep shading. The challenging element of the painting for the Victorian viewer is that in effect they're painted in HD, in high definition. Every detail is in focus. The whole depth of field is sharp. And this is one of the criticisms that was raised against them, that we do not view the world in that way. The further away something is, the less sharp it is to our eye. But the Pre-Raphaelites didn't adopt that approach. They would give as much detail to the background of their paintings as the foreground, and that made them look rather peculiar to the Victorian viewer who'd been raised on a slightly different approach. But it is one reason why I think it's very interesting to see these works in the flesh, as it were, and actually you do need to stand in front of them for a long time to assimilate all the detail and the symbolism. So the place to see Pre-Raphaelite paintings, Tate Britain, but also the provincial galleries, so Birmingham, Manchester, the Walker at Liverpool and the Lady Lever at Port Sunlight all have incredible collections of Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Their inspirations. I've mentioned Italian artists before Raphael. Raphael paints beauty rather than truth, so they prefer to paint truth. They thought the artists of the Northern Renaissance were ignored by the Royal Academy, probably correctly. So Albrecht Dürer from Germany, Van Eyck from Flanders, and Holbein were all artists that they revered, who they did not think were recognised by academic training. Hogarth was also important to them. Hogarth had really, a century before, had painted a very English school of art, unaffected by whatever the French were doing, so that was important to them. His paintings, like Gin Lane, depicted the truth, the unpleasant truth of life in his period. And similarly, Blake they revered because of his role as a visionary and as a poet. And these chaps, the Nazarenes, were German artists in Rome in the 1820s. They lived in a disused convent. They wore long hair and simple clothes, which is how they acquired the nickname of the Nazarenes, disciples of Jesus. And they painted religious subjects in a brightly coloured form. Both Dyce and Ford Madox Brown, had met and studied with the Nazarenes in Rome. And they were very favoured by Anglo-Catholics, the paintings of the Nazarenes. And the subject matter? The Bible, but very often scenes of a religious nature, full of symbols rather than direct scenes from the Bible, such as the crucifixion. Paintings from history. They didn't deride the form of history painting, but they thought it could be put to a different use. In literature, they're very much influenced by the medieval in form of Chaucer, by Shakespeare, and then by the Romantics. Keats, Walter Scott and Tennyson all feature heavily in their subject matter, as does the romantic, but very often associated together with the tragic. And in the later phase, Rossetti and Burne-Jones in particular, the tales of Thomas Malory, tales of Arthurian legend become very important. And I've mentioned the position of the vulnerable in society, women. These were an important part of their subject matter. Rossetti, however, always struggled with contemporary subjects, and he was increasingly drawn towards the medieval. So that's where the inspiration of Arthurian legend starts to come in. So I'm going to concentrate in looking at the works of these painters on the three most influential members of the Brotherhood. Probably the best known as well. So we have, from left to right, Millet, Dante Rossetti, and Holman Hunt. The Brotherhood very often produced what were known as friendship portraits. They drew portraits of each other. They also modelled for each other, so in the paintings you will quite often see one of the other members of the Brotherhood as a character in one of the paintings. The sketch of Millet is by Hunt. The centre one of Rossetti, slightly later than the formal dates of the Brotherhood, is a self-portrait, and Hunt, I've shown here a portrait of him in later life, showing the kind of Old Testament prophet that he became. He took to dressing in kind of Middle Eastern style and grew that very impressive hipster beard. He went to the Holy Land actually in the 1850s. Rossetti, in the centre there, was always admired as much as a poet, as an artist, and other members of the Brotherhood kind of dabbled in poetry, but Rossetti is probably the preeminent poet of the group. So it's time we looked at some paintings. So this is the first painting really on PRB principles, produced by Millet when he was aged 20. It's taken from, well, originally it's a story from the Decameron by Boccaccio, the stories that were told by refugees from the Black Death in Florence. Keats used it as the basis of a poem called Isabella or the Pot of Basil. The basic story, without going into too much detail, is that Isabella, who we can see there stroking her greyhound, has fallen in love with a clerk employed by her 4 brothers who sit on the other side of the table. And as you can see, they're not particularly impressed by the fact that the clerk, Lorenzo, who's offering her the orange, has fallen in love with their sister. They have other ideas, and they murder Lorenzo, burying him in a nearby wood. Isabella wonders where he's gone and eventually tracks down the grave. She exhumes Lorenzo, cuts his head off and plants it in a pot of basil, which you can see on the windowsill in the background on the right. And not surprisingly, basil planted on top of a human head grows rather well. It's very good fertilizer, and the brothers start to worry, why has she got this pot of basil and why is it growing so well? And eventually they uncover what has happened, destroy the skull, and Isabella dies of a broken heart. So that's the story that's been illustrated here. Now, it wasn't really attacked at the time, unlike some later Pre-Raphaelite works. People thought that this was an interesting composition. But what's new about it? Well, first of all, the composition is unbalanced. Right? So you've got 8 people on one side of the painting and 4 on the others. So the 4 bad guys are on one side and the potentially good guys are on the other, but they don't balance each other out. And then there's also a slightly strange perspective in the painting, because if you say, well, where's the vanishing point of this painting? So where do all the lines converge in the vanishing point of the painting? And there isn't one. And if you look through the window and the back wall, say, well, actually, what shape is this room? It's very difficult to work out. So what the Pre-Raphaelites do is to build the composition rather than having a vanishing point that all the lines converge on. What Millet has done is produce a series of planes parallel to the viewer in the painting. So in the foreground you have the brother who's kicking the dog and Isabella. If you move to the next plane, there's another brother and there's Lorenzo, and you can take these steps back through the painting, each of those planes parallel to the viewer. So that's the novel compositional technique. And the use of symbols I've mentioned before, so you can tell that the brother in the foreground is not at all happy with what's going on. Look at the expression on his face, but he's also kicking the dog. He's wielding those nutcrackers rather fiercely. In his anger, if you just look under the point of his elbow, he's knocked over the salt, which is always a problematical mark, spilled salt. If you have a look at the Royal Academy at the reproduction or the version of Leonardo's Last Supper, you'll see there that Judas has knocked over the salt. Bad news. If you look at the seat on which Isabella is sitting, carved at the bottom are the initials PRB, but at the time in 1849 no one knew what this meant, because the brotherhood was almost a kind of secret society. They didn't advertise the fact that they were a brotherhood, apart from including the letters PRB in their painting, so people didn't know what it meant, so it didn't disturb them. I mentioned using other members of the brotherhood as models. So at the far end of the table, the person with the glass raised drinking from the glass, that's Dante Rossetti, and Lorenzo offering the orange to Isabella is William Rossetti. So Dante Rossetti was producing his own work at this time. This is an Annunciation, So the angel Gabriel, which again is his brother William, with fire, not with any wings, but with fire around his feet, is come to announce to Mary that she is going to have a baby. Mary is modelled by Christina Rossetti, so very much a family portrait. But this was greeted by a storm of abuse when it was exhibited at the Portland Gallery in 1850, so much so that Rossetti never actually exhibited in public again. It was called puerile and insipid, and a perversion of his talent. So you've got a tall and narrow painting evocative of a Gothic panel. It's white, picked out with gold and blue, some red in the background, all colours associated with the Virgin. But you can tell that Mary is somewhat troubled by the news that has been conveyed to her. This is not something that seems to be greeted with unalloyed enthusiasm. And the stem of the lily in the painting is pointing to her womb, so indicating what is to come. So that's a religious portrait as depicted by the Pre-Raphaelites. The next example is what the public had been trained to expect. So John Rogers Herbert had produced this conventional painting of Christ and his parents at Nazareth. You have a conventional landscape in the distance. Who knows whether Nazareth looks like that or not. Herbert certainly didn't. But you have these, as opposed to the Millet painting we looked at just now, you have strong diagonals of the house and the wall, and they converge in the distance somewhere. There's compositional recession into space, moves back into the painting without having the kind of planes that Isabella has. So Christ is depicted in a very conventional and idealized form. The focus of the paint is very soft focus. It's not very sharp, and not very much use of symbolism here. Potentially the wood in the foreground is the shape of a cross, but beyond that, not much. Mary is spinning. She's got a dove next to her, the Holy Ghost. Joseph is at work in his carpenter's shop, and I'm not quite sure what Christ is doing in this painting. But that's the conventional painting that the early Victorians would have wanted to see. And the next painting is where the outrage starts, because Millet in 1850 produces this painting, Christ in the House of His Parents. The realism in the painting was absolutely shocking to art critics, to the press and the public. So the Times had this to say of the painting: the attempt to associate the Holy Family with the meanest details of a carpenter's shop, with no conceivable omission of misery, dirt or even disease, all finished with the same loathsome minuteness, is disgusting. And Charles Dickens, in his role as journalist and editor of Household Words, had this to say: Mary looks like a monster in the vilest cabaret in France, or the lowest gin shop in England. A wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy in a bedgown, who appears to have received a poke playing in an adjacent gutter, and a perhaps fortunately unnamed review in I think in the Spectator said it was painful to see the Saviour portrayed as a red-headed Jew boy. Well, I suppose you can see in a way where that criticism is coming from. This is obviously a real carpenter's shop, and just look at all the shavings on the floor, the wood in the background. Through the door you can see a whole herd of sheep who are looking at us. In fact, Millet bought sheep's head from the local butchers to paint those and use them until they started decomposing and the smell became too awful. But there's a lot of symbolism in the painting. In the background there is a dove. The figure of Christ himself, he's obviously been injured on a nail in the door that Joseph is making, and that is the wound in his hand, and the blood from that wound is dropping onto his feet. This is all prefigures the crucifixion, clearly. And the figure on the right bringing some water to bathe the wound is John the Baptist. We know it's John the Baptist because he's wearing that kind of fur loincloth that John the Baptist always wear, but he's carrying a baptismal bowl. The symbol there is of the baptism of Christ. So this is Christ in childhood, prefiguring much which is to happen later on. Although it was roundly criticised at the time, it did actually sell. It sold before the exhibition opened for £350, and that's about £50,000 in today's money. So it was successful in a commercial sense. But interestingly, if you put the two together, yes, you can see the detail that is in the Millet, which isn't in the Herbert. But are they so different to provoke that storm of outrage? Now, one of the problems was that by this time the existence of the brotherhood had become a public knowledge, and everyone was rather suspicious of it, this kind of secret society. And certainly part of Dickens' criticism of this painting was that it was too Catholic. The bright colours and the subject matter, inspired by possibly the Nazarenes, they were Catholic, and this was what Catholic art represented, and for Dickens and many other people that was to be deprecated. Interestingly, Dickens, who was very closely involved with the art world, and Millet were reconciled later on, and if you go to the Charles Dickens Museum, there is a pencil sketch in one of the rooms by Millet of Dickens on his deathbed. They were that close by the time Dickens died in 1870. So at the same time as Millet was exhibiting at the Royal Academy Christ in the House of His Parents, Hunt was exhibiting this, Valentine rescuing Silvia from Proteus. This is a scene from The Two Gentlemen of Verona. And it's interesting in this reproduction that we see the actual frame, we see the shape of the painting, and we see the fact that Hunt has included the quotes from Shakespeare to demonstrate what's going on here. For those of you who don't know the story of Two Gentlemen of Verona or parts of the scene, what has happened here is that Valentine, who's the gentleman in the centre of the painting, has just rescued Sylvia, kneeling on the ground, from being raped by Proteus, who's looking rather ashamed of himself on the right, and has obviously just been cuffed around the back of the head by Valentine. The line in Shakespeare that this represents, because obviously Shakespeare does not represent an actual rape, is Two Gentlemen of Verona, Act 5, Scene 4. ruffian let go that rude uncivil touch. That's the line that Hunt is demonstrating here. He designed and made all the costumes, and the outdoor scene was all painted in Knoll Park. The Pre-Raphaelites developed a technique of painting the background outside and then filling in the figures in the studio. The figure of Sylvia is Lizzie Siddal, who we'll come across later on, and the Times had this to say about this one: "We cannot censure at present as amply or as strongly as we desire to do the strange disorder of the mind or the eyes which continues to range with unabated absurdity among a class of artists who style themselves PRB." There is a storm of outrage whenever a work produced by someone known to be associated with the Brotherhood is exhibited. And another Millet, probably I think one of his most famous paintings, Ophelia, a scene from Hamlet, where we don't actually see this in Hamlet. It's described, I think, by Gertrude that Ophelia has died and drowned. So again, this is Lizzie Siddal. Lizzie Siddal, found by one of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, I think it was Collinson, working in a milliner's, but she had the look that the Pre-Raphaelites were really interested in as a model, and she was persuaded to model for all of them at various stages, and then she became a painter in her own right as well, and we'll hear what happened to her later on. But for this painting, the outdoor scenes were painted at the River Ewell near Kingston upon Thames, with the space left for the figure, and then Siddal was put in a bath while Millet painted the bath kind of warmed by candles underneath the cast iron bath, but at one stage the candles all went out. Millet was too preoccupied to notice, and Siddal developed pneumonia as a result. Now the PRB paintings may well have evoked the scorn of the critics, but they were appreciated by women, and women who would stand for a long time in front of this painting, assimilating the detail of the various plants that are mentioned in Hamlet, and by the figure of Ophelia herself. And Collins here is not a member of the Brotherhood, but he paints in their style. This is the first Pre-Raphaelite landscape, I think, painted from a window overlooking Regent's Park. At this time it's still not really possible to paint al fresco. The technology isn't there, so what Collins does is to paint from a window. But again, this provoked a storm of criticism. This is what was said: the botanical predominates over the artistical, and to a vicious and mistaken extreme. They take a branch, a flower, a blade of grass, place it close before them, and as closely copy it, forgetting that these objects at the distance imagined in the picture could by no means be seen with such minuteness. But of course this is entirely in line with Ruskin's principles. Charles Collins, is the brother of Wilkie Collins, the novelist, and became the son-in-law of Charles Dickens. He married Dickens' daughter Katie, who moved in very artistic circles. And you can see every detail in those trees. It's not really a Gainsborough-like landscape, where Gainsborough used bits of driftwood and sticks of broccoli to represent trees and rocks. This is painting nature as she is, and that brings us back to Ruskin. It's a rather busy slide. I did, pause and read it if you wish to. I've highlighted the important things. The Times in May 1851, the summer exhibition opened a couple of days after the Crystal Palace opened in 1851, and the Times was outraged. Again, it's absurd, a contempt for perspective. We saw that in the Isabella painting. A devotion to the minute, seeking out every excess of sharpness and deformity. And then it has a go at the Academy, saying, what are you doing allowing these artists through your hallowed walls? They are a disgrace. They should do better. This is a mere joke. Do not inflict it on the public. And at this stage, Ruskin weighs into the arguments. He writes a letter to the Times immediately after this, which defends up to a point what the Brotherhood's doing. He says that the review is scornful, and that what the artists are trying to do is to be faithful to the truth, and that they should be encouraged. Basically, don't write them off. They could be a very important movement. They paint what they see, and that is what Ruskin believed was important. And he explains, why. I don't think he very much supports the term Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but he understands why they consider that Raphael is the start of everything going wrong, basically. So, as I said, do pause and read that if you want to read the two different views. But the impact is, as soon as Ruskin appears on the side, if you like, of the Brotherhood, they start to be accepted, and this outrage that's been developed up to now dies away. Hunt Our English Coasts. This was painted at Fairlight near Hastings, and described as the brightest landscape since Turner, and the sun illuminates all the details. What's it about? Well, Hunt really thought that this was 1852. The British were very afraid of an invasion by the French of the southern coasts, and Holman says, well, look, the British are just waiting here like sheep to be invaded. They're doing nothing. They're not taking any actions to defend. They're just lying down. They're getting tangled up in thorns. They're very sheep-like. Eventually, the work gets exhibited in France in 1856. When Delacroix says, I am really astounded by Hunt's sheep. They were so naturalistic, so lifelike. But the title obviously was changed at that stage. It was changed to Strayed Sheep. All we like sheep have gone astray. Those who know the Messiah will recognise. Perhaps showing a tact which wasn't also always apparent with Hunt. So the next year, Hunt moves on to the social and contemporary topics, key to which is the role of the fallen woman. And what we see here is a woman who suddenly realises the situation she's got herself involved in. She's not married, she's not wearing a wedding ring, yet she is cavorting with this young man, and she jumps up, perhaps struck by remorse. And as a woman, she has a lot more to lose from this situation than the man does. The woman in the model for the woman is Annie Miller, who was, well, descriptions vary. Some people say she was a prostitute, some say she was just a good time girl who'd Hunt met in Chelsea and wanted her to model for him. Eventually Hunt wanted to marry her, but only if she could be educated and improved, and that proved to be impossible at the end of the day, so they didn't marry. But Hunt really wanted to, if you like, to rescue her. But in this painting you can see that she's jumped up. If you look on the left under the table, there is a cat pounced on a bird. There is tangled threads on the right, the foreground of embroidery wool. There's a single glove on the floor, and the music is Tennyson's Tears, Idle Tears. So all this symbolic of the kind of difficult position that she's got herself in. But if you look in the background of the painting, actually we see a mirror, so we can see the reflection of her hair, and you can also see behind us, the viewer, this garden which she's gazing into through the open window. This is what perhaps she's hoping to escape to. And the use of the mirror in the background is perhaps very reminiscent of the say the Arnolfini portrait by Van Eyck. Again, would have been very valued by the Pre-Raphaelites. The critics found the work repulsive because of its subject matter, but Ruskin, in his views on the painting, said he thought the painting of the furniture was exquisite. And there's every chance that Hunt considered that painting as a companion piece to this, which is probably his most famous work, The Light of the World. We see Christ knocking at a door, and perhaps that is what the woman in the previous painting has heard. She has heard the knocking of Christ at the door, and jumped up because she realizes the error of her ways. The door that Christ is knocking on, actually, if you look at it, has no handle. It can't be opened from this side. So Christ knocks at the door, but you have to open it to him from the other side. There's a few versions of this painting. The biggest version now hangs in St. Paul's Cathedral. We'll talk about that a bit later. So in 1853, the Ruskins plus Millais and Millet's brother holiday in Scotland on a painting trip. I mentioned that Ruskin's marriage to Effie was unconsummated. There's a suggestion that Ruskin was trying to entice Millet and his wife to engage in an affair, a sexual relationship, which would have given him grounds for divorce, which would have protected his reputation, but absolutely ruined the reputation of Millet and of Effie. But that didn't happen. But it represents a break in the relationship between Millet and Ruskin. Ruskin, who supported Millet to this type, after the annulment of the marriage, his wife goes on to marry Millet, and that kind of destroys the relationship. But at any event, by this time Millet is drifting away from Pre-Raphaelite character. He's moving towards the mainstream, really. Hunt travelled to the Holy Land in 1854. He was interested in Jewish ritual, and he wanted to get the right background for his religious paintings, which he was increasingly interested in. The scapegoat in Jewish ritual is expelled to the wilderness, carrying with it the sins of the people. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1856. Ruskin didn't like the sentiment in the painting. He said, in his earnest desire to paint a scapegoat, he has forgotten to ask himself first whether he could paint a goat at all. But typical of the very religious paintings that Hunt became well known for, they were very much the Victorian taste. Ford Madox Brown, I said, associated with the group, though never a member. At the height of the gold rush, one of the brethren, Thomas Woolner, emigrated to Australia, and Brown went to Gravesend to see him off. And this was the inspiration for this painting, where you see a middle class couple in the foreground, who are actually Brown and his wife, are putting up with the privations of this voyage and mixing with the lower working class people in the background to seek a better life. I quite like some of the detail in this painting. So you've got in the foreground, you've got the cabbages hung up to salt in the sea air, provide food for the rest of the voyage. The man's hat is held on by the cord, which is attached to the button on his coat, and you can just about work out that the woman is actually cradling a baby, and you can see the baby's hand held in hers under her shawl there. Because of its detail, it took Brown a long time, took 3 years to complete. By the time he finished it, Woolner had actually come back to this country from Australia. Brown was also interested in social issues. Take Your Son, Sir. It's obviously a woman who has fallen pregnant, and again there's the mirror in the background, much more like the mirror in the Arnolfini portrait, but you can see in the mirror behind her head, which has a halo type of effect, you can see the man who is the father of the boy, and she is saying, take responsibility for what you've done. The painting is unfinished, but it's typical of kind of concern with social issues of the Pre-Raphaelites. Mayhew's London Poor and London Labour had been published in 1851 and graphically described the deprivations suffered by the poor, and revealed the extent to which women were being driven to prostitution. And 1857, the year of this painting, is the year of the Divorce Bill, which meant that a woman could sue for divorce, but only on grounds of desertion or cruelty, not for adultery. And here's another unfinished work on the same theme. I mentioned that Rossetti struggled with modern themes. A farmer enters London via Blackfriars Bridge to find his fallen sweetheart by the road, touting for business, and the symbol of this is a calf in the cart kept in place by the net. In one of the sketches for this work, she is clearly against the wall of a churchyard, and there's a tombstone above the wall. But as I said, Rossetti struggled with modern social themes, and he also, as you can see from this, struggled with perspective. He never quite mastered perspective, and though the other members of the Brotherhood tried to help him with this, he kind of gave up works that needed perspective in the end. I mentioned Dice, this earlier painting. I quite like this painting of Pegwell Bay. He said met the Nazarenes in 1820 and adopted their ideas. He'd painted frescoes in the House of Lords and portraits. He was on the hanging committee of the Royal Academy and approved of Hunt and Millais. And he said, I suspect we modern painters do not study nature enough in the open air or in broad daylight. Technically difficult to paint using oil paint outside, because this is pre the development of tubed paint. But kind of painting in plein air, usually attributed to the Impressionists. I think the Pre-Raphaelites were moving in that direction. By the time of this painting, Rossetti has ceased to paint, I think, in line with the philosophy of the PRB. He's no longer concerned with morally elevating subjects. Now on, the majority of his pictures were portraits of beautiful, bejewelled women, usually alone and usually of bust or three-quarter length, with fanciful titles in Italian or Latin. And written on the back of this was the quote, "The mouth that has been kissed loses not its freshness, still it renews itself even as does the moon." So this is, I think, if you said Pre-Raphaelite painting, a lot of people, this is the type of thing they would consider, but I suggest it's not as Pre-Raphaelite as some others. Lizzie Siddal had married Rossetti, but died of an overdose of laudanum in 1862, probably a suicide. She's portrayed here as Beatrix, the first Dante's ideal love, at the moment of death. So a bird drops a poppy into her hands, and the figures in the background, you see that you've lost all the detail in the background in this painting, which was, you know, the mark of the Pre-Raphaelites. There is Dante, the original Dante, on one side, and Love on the other, observing what is happening, and a sundial to mark the passage of time. It's almost a reversal of Ruskin's approach to realism, its idealised beauty and its lack of detail. Now, Rossetti buried his poems with Lizzie Siddal in Highgate Cemetery, but he was later prevailed upon to exhume her to retrieve the poems and get them published, which he did in 1870. In the early 1860s, the disciples of Rossetti ceased to be preoccupied with social, moral and religious problems, and instead began to appeal to the senses, exploring the possibilities of carefully balanced harmonies of colour and texture. So this paves the way for the aesthetic movement. Whistler is a prime example of a painter influenced by this approach, and he's actually, if you search my other talks, Whistler is someone who I've done a talk on, and you can clearly see the line from Rossetti to Whistler in portraits like this. But there were still some painters carrying on the preoccupations of the Pre-Raphaelite, the social preoccupations, and this is an incredibly detailed painting. There's so much detail on it, I can't hope to cover all of it. It's set in Heath Street, Hampstead, during the construction of the London sewers, so it's all about the distribution of labour in an industrialised society, but it also, I think, harks back to the paintings of Hogarth, the really busy activity going on all over the painting. You see some reference to intellectual effort. On the right, the two chaps who seem to be watching everyone else at work, that is Thomas Carlyle and F.D. Morris, who are great thinkers about the industrialised society. You've got different ages and different types of navvy. On the left hand side, you've got the people who don't work. You've got a beggar, you've got women, married women, distributing tracts on the evil of drink to the navvies, who obviously need the drink with all the hard work they're doing. And you have the rich on horseback, whose way is impeded by the hole in the road that the navvies are digging. There's lots of other details on here. It's well worth reading up about this particular painting, because there is just so much. Every figure actually tells a story in this. But by the 1860s, the late 1860s, is an example of what I've called a phase 2 Pre-Raphaelite, inspired by Rossetti. Burne-Jones said what he was painting was a beautiful romantic dream of something that never was, never will be, in a light better than any light that ever shone. So that's not realism. That's not Ruskin's ideal of realism. So this is Medea preparing a poisoned garment to kill Jason's lover, Glauce, I think her name is. But there's lots of details in here you wouldn't normally find in a Victorian painting. If you look carefully, there's a couple of copulating toads in the left foreground. But this is a strong female figure, which the second phase Pre-Raphaelites were very interested in producing. It's a frightening portrait. This is a woman who is actually capable of infanticide. She goes on to kill her own children, fathered by Jason. It was accepted by the Royal Academy for display in 1868, but then never hung. It was considered to be too challenging. But at the same time, there were other approaches to Pre-Raphaelitism inspired by Rossetti. Simeon Solomon is a Jewish artist from the East End, a homosexual, and he produces this kind of male version of Rossetti's women. There were close links here with the poems of Swinburne and the aesthetic movement leading to Whistler and to decadence. This is where this type of work, this portrait of Bacchus, is taking us. A very good-looking young man. But Solomon's reputation was ruined in 1873 by an indecency conviction. He went into the St Giles workhouse and never emerged, dying there 25 years later. Hunt, meantime, is continuing with his very successful paintings on religious themes. I quite like this one, The Shadow of Death. So Christ at work as a carpenter with a very Victorian saw. There he's been working at. He stands up to stretch because his back aches, and Mary on the left sees the shadow on the wall of the crucifixion. Obviously she sees what is to come, so the stance that Christ is adopting is very much the stance of the crucified Christ, the man of sorrows, the look on Christ's face to heaven with the star above him. I think I quite like this. Obviously along the same lines as the Millet Christ in the house of his parents, yeah, interesting example of what Hunt was doing. And some people say that Hunt was the only painter who really continued in the original Pre-Raphaelite style. Here's Burne-Jones, the second phase. Burne-Jones and Morris were great disciples of Rossetti. They sought him out when he was teaching at a working man's college, and this kind of approach led to the arts and craft movement. This is the inspiration, Arthurian legend, the drapery and the quite restricted palette, so not as bright as the early Pre-Raphaelites. So what was Millet up to at this time? He was producing sentimental stuff like this. He devolved into the most successful British portraitist. He produced sentimental portraits of children like this one, and the other one is Bubbles, which we all know, I suspect. This is a little girl dressed in the 18th century style, and it's actually inspired by the much reviled Sir Slosher Reynolds, who'd painted Penelope Boothby in 1788. We'll compare the two in a minute. But Millet allowed his images to be exploited for commercial purposes, so the portrait of Bubbles becomes famous as a advert for Pear's soap. Just compare the two. That's Millet and Reynolds. Well, Millet, who had started off by rebellion against everything that Reynolds stood for, has turned into Joshua Reynolds. This is one of Rossetti's last paintings. The model is Jane Morris, the wife of William Morris, with whom Rossetti had an affair in the 1870s. It includes in the top corner, though you won't be able to make out the details, a Rossetti poem. Proserpine is the abducted bride of Hades, the god of the underworld, and because she had eaten one pomegranate seed in the underworld, she was forced to stay there for 6 months every year in a loveless marriage. Potentially that's Rossetti's comment on Jane's marriage to William Morris. But the very pre-Raphaelite hair. So what happened to the movement and the three principal members of it? Well, Rossetti remained close to Morris and Burne-Jones, very actively involved originally in the arts and crafts movement and the aesthetic movement. Whistler introduced him to Japanese prints and Chinese blue and white porcelain, which he collected, but his health was suffering. He was also exhibiting some very strange behaviour. He was fascinated with wombats and kept two as a pet. He also owned a llama and a toucan, which was trained to ride the llama around the dining room wearing a cowboy hat. He had a menagerie at Cheyne Walk, which his brother said consisted of, at various times, a Pomeranian puppy, an Irish deerhound, owls, rabbits, dormice, hedgehogs, wombats, marmots, armadillos, kangaroos, wallabies, a deer, raccoon, squirrels, a mole, peacocks, moor owls, jackdaws, a kookaburra, parakeets, parrots, raven, chameleons, lizards and salamanders, all in Cheyne Walk in Chelsea. That must have been some collection. But Rossetti attempted suicide in 1872. He suffered paranoia and depression, and he became addicted to sedatives. Chloral is a sedative, and alcohol after a botched operation, and died at the age of 53. Millet was reabsorbed into the art establishment. He became a full academician in 1863. He was baronet in 1885 and president of the Royal Academy in 1896, just shortly before his death. He wasn't president for very long. He died in 1896 and is buried in St Paul's Cathedral. And Holman Hunt lived even longer. He continued to produce successful religious art which appealed to Victorian sensibilities. A large copy of The Light of the World, which now hangs in St Paul's, was produced in 1904 and sent on a world tour. It was seen by millions of people in Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia, and in one reckoning 4 million people in Australia paid to see it. So he was extremely successful. So that's the story of the Pre-Raphaelites and their intentions and what they eventually delivered. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find other videos that I've produced on my YouTube channel called Art for Art's Sake, or I've got a link down there which I hope works and will take you to the channel so you can see other presentations that I've produced. But I hope you enjoyed this one and that you'll listen to more.